Well, listen, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second of our webinars. The rationale behind this, myself and Siniša have written something, a couple of volumes of sociological theory, and the books were intended as an introduction to a number of sociological theories and perspectives. And in order to sort of supplement that, we're trying to make sociological theory much more accessible. We're having a series of webinars. The first was with Randall Collins, and today we're very happy to have Arlie Hochschild talking about her own work, very important work. So just on that note, maybe just to give a sort of outline, essentially we'll just ask, myself and Siniša will ask several questions, and hopefully we'll also leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for people to through the chat function to put forward some questions. So we'll be a little bit of time at the end for you to also ask any questions you have about Arlie's work. Okay, on that, I'll pass you over to Siniša, who'll just give us a short introduction to Arlie's work.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to welcome Arlie to UCD, even in this form, if we cannot have you in person. And also welcome to our audience from all over the world. I'll just say a few words about Arlie before we move on to the questions. So Arlie is a professor emerita of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. She has been pioneer of sociology of emotions. She's probably the first sociological theorist who took emotions seriously and created a number of really useful and creative concepts that we still use and we will be using for many years from now, such as emotional labor and feeling rules, economy of gratitude, global care chains, more recently deep stories, and many others. She has completed her PhD at Berkeley in '69, and she has taught for a short period of time at Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, and then most of her career at Berkeley, and retired recently. She's written many books and many articles, many edited volumes as well. I'll just mention a few of the most significant ones. The first book, The Unexpected Community, Portrait of an Old Age Subculture. Then The Managed Hard, the most influential book, Commercialization of Human Feeling. Then The Second Shift, Working Parents and the Revolution at Home. The Time Bind, When Work Becomes Home and Home Becomes Work. The Commercialization of Intimate Life, Notes from Home and Work. Then The Outsourced Self, Intimate Life in Market Times. And most recently, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. She has received many awards, and there's no time for us to go through everything, but I just want to emphasize that she was awarded Ulysses Medal from UCD, and we're very proud for that. Very few social scientists receive this award. It's mostly kind of people from medicine, and that was University College, the highest accolade. So thanks very much again, Arlie, for joining us here. Steve, you take over maybe the first question.
Yeah, so Arlie, maybe just an introduction for people who wouldn't know your work. How did you become interested in sociology, and particularly sort of sociology of emotions?
I think sociology picked me instead of me picking it. I had an experience when I was 12 that I think where I was pulled out of what I thought of as a normal childhood in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And my father was assigned to Israel, and suddenly I found myself at a Scottish mission school, very strict. The only American, didn't speak Hebrew, had funny Oxford shoes that were quite the thing in Silver Spring, Maryland, but were just bizarre at this mission school. And I had taller than everyone, dressed weird. I became the stranger, the outsider. And I think while painful at the time, I soon made wonderful friends and it worked out extraordinarily well. But at the time, I began to ask questions, and that stranger's eye, I think a lot of sociologists, I think that's maybe what we have in common and why I feel so at home in this discipline. And I carried it with me when I went back to America. I didn't fit in there either. So it's the outsider's eye. That's how I got to sociology. It became my friend. And sociology of emotion had for me a different origin, I think. In my family, my mother was the one to say, "Are you enjoying your scrambled eggs? And how do you feel, dear, today?" And she kind of managed the emotional atmosphere of the home, and it became her job to do that for other people, for foreigners, that it was my dad's job to relate to. She became the emotional manager. And somewhere along the way in college, I read A.J. Ayer's book, Language, Truth, and Logic, which completely put down this kind of thing. If you're saying, how are you feeling today, dear? That was like saying boo. Just erase it. It had no cognitive content, wasn't important. And I thought, well, wait a minute. And this was when I got to Berkeley, sociology, and the excitement of the 1960s. I thought, well, wait a minute. There is a whole, if this is the going truth, that the kind of work that my mother does, the small talk, see, men did big talk and women did small talk. Oh, wait a minute, this small talk has a function, it's important, it holds the world up. It's mopping the floor, but hey, we need mopped floors. So I think it was putting together what I had watched her do and the put down of it. And I wanted to say, we need this thing called emotional labor. And that led me to see in an emotional kind of a way.
Yeah. And I think this, you mentioned the kind of the 1960s context of this kind of political movements emerging, Vietnam War, civil rights movements, and that has influenced you. You became very politicized early on. I think, if I'm correct, this was already in New Zealand when you were very young, and that stayed with you for the rest of your life. And kind of, could you tell us a little bit more about that context of the 60s and how it shaped your thinking?
Yeah, it was a very politically alive time. And I jumped in with both feet. I was a civil rights worker in Vicksburg, Mississippi, teaching Black history in 1964. So I jumped into that. There was the war in Vietnam, and there was a big protest against that, and marched with that. My husband was very active in the anti-war movement. And then there was feminism blooming, and I began to re-see sociology along with others in the department at the time. We met in an apartment, in my apartment, weekly to have conversations. It was an electric kind of experience. I think the part of me that is a public sociologist, the part of me that wants to talk to people outside the discipline, comes from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So you have this sort of conjunction of your own interests and the 60s taking place. Who were the sort of major figures then that really influenced your early work? Goffman seems to be one person, but his sociology itself is not particularly political in that sense. But there's others like C. Wright Mills and David Reisman. What sort of thinkers were there that helped you or helped to shape your analysis?
Well, it's interesting. C. Wright Mills seemed to just jump into America as it was, taking its troubles as his own, and as he's famously said, putting together private troubles with social issues. And that felt perfect, that, okay, I'm going to try and do that too. Goffman, however, was detached from that enterprise, but was a model of observation. Now, he didn't observe emotions, and I came to know him after he left Berkeley, and he said, look, if you can pull this off, bring emotions in, hats off to you, that'll be amazing. But I don't think you can. No, it's too messy, avoid it. And he was a little bit there with A.J. Ayer. Oh, that's something else. And so we had a difference, a very friendly difference there. But, and I read a lot of sociology, but looking for perspective, I also actually read a lot and was influenced by Freud. Yeah. There, especially, his whole idea of an unconscious. And I think I kind of see myself as trying to do a sociological unconscious. There are things going on that we don't look at or dare to look at, or there are obstacles to seeing, and it's our job to lift them to awareness.
Yeah, could I just sort of add to that? I mean, they seem to be, Freud and Goffman seem to be earlier theorists that influenced your work. Is there I mean, obviously no one's theoretical perspective remains static. There seems to be a shift in your own work. I mean, this looking at the sort of the management of emotions, how we handle emotions, how we deal with emotions in situations. To your sort of work that in the latest book on Strangers, where you're talking about these empathy walls, trying to breach this sort of the divisions. Is there a shift in your perspective, do you think? Is there a development in your analysis of emotions?
Very much so, and I would see several ways that it's shifted in my early work in the managed heart. I was looking at these fairly low down service jobs where you were closely supervised and it was more estranging. And I think in the outsourced self, I'm looking at a lot of jobs that are highly complex that take empathy. And I think empathy and being really good at empathy, really being able to crawl into the sensibility of another person. And a lot of the care workers that I interviewed and imagined to be estranged actually loved their work and were brilliant at it. And I had to say, wow, this is a new form of an empathic form of emotional labor. Many people do. So I think the kind of work that I've studied changed, and where the realm that I'm applying it to has changed. In my early work, I was looking at the economy and how it rests upon our sensibility, what it calls for. Now I'm looking at the polity. Now I'm looking at politics. And if I'm doing an interview with someone, if my current project is in Eastern Kentucky, I'm in the middle of Appalachia, and talking mainly to conservative white men, and looking at how they're responding to a march that of neo-Nazis and KKK. So I'm looking at how they locate themselves. And in an interview, what am I listening for? They're telling me what they're telling me, but I'm with the sensitizing concept of emotions, I'm listening for what feeling rules he's proposing to me. What does he want me to feel about abortion, about gun control, about Donald Trump. And is there a backing up a kind of an emotional paradigm behind his views? And in this conversation, which may wander, I like wandering conversations. I'm interested in how they wander.
Yeah.
He's reminded of. And I've noticed, I mean, it's altered my whole view of politics, which seems to me, initially when I went down to Louisiana for that work, I thought of politics something quite solid. And, you know, you had positions on guns, abortion, is it okay to get rich, and so on. But I am now backing up and looking at the paradigm that determines the target of rage and dissatisfaction. And in other words, emotion, politics isn't like a block of attitudes. It's liquid. It shifts and targets of shift. For example, talking to a man who, this is in an area where people have lost their coal jobs. The well-paid coal jobs are out. Low-level service jobs that women take are in, and an opiate crisis is coming. They're stayers. They're not leaving, and they're stuck, and they're sad. They'll start with anger, but they're in mourning. They're honestly in mourning, and not just people, but the community. So where does that go? I'm hearing kind of over time, you get a refrain, well, people aren't noticing us, and nobody comes. We're the last in line. We're stereotyped as hillbillies if we are visible. Mainly, we're not visible. We don't. So they'll say that about a range of things. That becomes the theme. And when I ask them about Blacks and Black Lives Matter, what's really fascinating and to me is that they seem to have what I would call, this is just what I'm working on now, empathy envy. I would call it empathy envy. Well, you pay all that attention to Black Lives Matter, you know, you worry about their poverty. Well, we're poor here, you know, you worry about their drug problem. We've got a drug problem here. You care about them more. It isn't just dollars and cents resources that they're keyed on. It is not receiving empathy. And that's got me to think, and I've now written about empathy maps and how when two people talk, they're overlaying one empathy map on another. So you can see the journey that one gets on with a sensitizing concept that leads you to be interested in emotions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Just a question on, you know, how do you see the current state of sociological theory? So when you were a student, you know, there was a dominance of functionalism and Marxism and kind of fairly rationalist perspectives. And, you know, you brought something very different, this kind of focus on emotions. And sociology of emotions has developed since, you know, now it's a fairly vibrant area. But there are so many other approaches out there. And what would be your reaction to what's happening in sociological theory today?
You know, Troy Duster, who was president of the ASA some years ago, kind of warned that sociology had two paradigms to one side or the other of it. One was a genetic paradigm that claimed a kind of hard determinism. Well, we really just are genes, you know. There's an empathy gene, you know, there's a right-wing gene, a criminal gene, and so on. Claiming a lot of sociological territory from a genetic perspective. And then on the other hand, we have economics that puts in a hard determinism for, if you know how a person is slotted economically, everything else is predicted. And so sociology has sort of gotten squeezed between that, and it's pushing back. It's pushing back, but I don't see any of the grand narratives of the 19th century of a Freud or a Marx. And everyone's, defines themselves vis-a-vis those paradigms. It's more some, I think, extremely brilliant meso level and micro level work. And it doesn't have a cohesion. It's respectful, there are many subfields and they grow, but I think that's the state of it. But if I look at what I learn from, what I do is not say, oh, how can I develop sociological theory? What I do is take a problem that feels important to me and interesting to me, and then I look around and see who said some really interesting stuff on this. And in thinking through strangers, I have found a lot of use in the linguist George Lakoff, the use of metaphor. I thought, oh, let me use that as a method to get the feeling. So Thomas Frank in politics, Michel Lamont on respect, Andrew Charlin, incredible work on families, what's happening to blue-collar families. And the social class divide, Wilkerson Pickett's and the spirit level, and what happens when the whole economy is rigged for inequality. So what I do is draw on this rich trove that sociology has offered, and I think that's and applied it to the problems of the day. So what I think of it, is that okay? Yes, I would like a more kind of cohesion, I guess, at a macro level, but in the meantime, I think we're doing great.
Thanks.
Yeah, Arlie, if I can just go back to, I just have a question really. When I was reading through the Strangers book, there's a very interesting discussion there about emotions. I was wondering how do you relate emotions and feelings to sort of forms of moral systems and cultural values? I mean, what I'm trying to get at here, in cultural studies, for example, people like Raymond Williams or Stuart Hall look at how values become dominant and how, but for me, when and you also talk about this in Strangers, you talk about how people, they have these deep stories and they have this sense of, they draw on their religion, they draw on this hatred of taxation, and this loss of honor. So how particularly in the South, you were talking about in Louisiana, how do you relate sort of these sort of emotions and moral frameworks? Do emotions underpin these moral frameworks, or are they shaped in turn by them?
They underpin them. I think the moral framework is a way of, in a way, managing. Yeah. It's a giant emotion management mechanism. And at the same time, these frameworks can be subverted. Again, starting with emotion. I'll give you an example. A lot of people have wondered how it could possibly be that strict Christians would so ardently embrace Donald Trump, who doesn't have a strictly Christian set of marriages or outside affairs. It doesn't have a strictly Christian knowledge of the Bible. You ask Donald Trump, well, what's your favorite book of the Bible? And he says, oh, I like them all, he holds the Bible upside down in DC at that event. So how does that, why on earth would these people go for this guy. And they just then conclude, well, these Christians are not very smart, and or they're corrupt themselves and relate to a corrupt person. And so they feel contempt, okay, which completely backfires and creates difficulties in my country, I think. And what I think is going on, and this again, I think speaks to moral frameworks and emotion, is that Donald Trump may not be able to read very well. I think he has learning disability for which he's compensated, probably feels a sense of shame about that. And they relate to that because they're shamed also, having imbibed a kind of more than others, kind of individualism. So if they're falling down the class ladder, they feel that's their fault. So I think, number one, he is speaking to that shame, and that these strict Christians like that. How does he speak to it? I think he gives us a daily ritual, and in 3 parts. In one part, he would, and it was in the New York Times, every other paper every day, he would say something outrageous. All immigrants, are rapists and thieves, Mexican immigrants, And people, then the punditry would say, oh, that's outrageous. You're a president. You can't say that. They would shame him. And he would then, number 3, roar back at the shamers. Now, I think at an unconscious level, that was relieving. That was cathartic to the people I was interviewing. Yeah, he told that those experts, and it relieved them of their shame. So we're looking at something under the radar that does speak to a moral framework of these Christians. And I think in a second way, Donald Trump actually came to be ratified himself. How could this be? I think it happened this way. He said, look, I am for you, you are for me. We're together. In other words, identify with me. And the next thing he said, I'm suffering for you. Right? Who's that remind you? I'm suffering for you against enemies, the treasonous press, the deep state, Democratic Party. I'm suffering for you. And people began to think that's a little like Christ, And then, okay, this is interpretive, but he doesn't wear a mask when COVID comes. He's bravado. And now he's egging on a right wing, a white supremacist with guns to walk on Pennsylvania Avenue on January 6th. In other words, I suffered for you. Now you suffer for me. And I will rise up and culturally dominate. This is a fantasy, okay, that is Foursquare Christian. And that's, I think, how to resolve a contradiction that would leave you scratching your head if you were sheerly an AJA rationalist. Something emotional has been going on, and we've had to uncover it, through informal conversations and repeated interviews and getting to know people. Those feelings come out, and I would theoretically formulate them as a way that feelings interact with moral frameworks.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of your work really it focuses on micro and meso level, kind of the way how everyday life is shaped and framed, and how emotions are controlled, and the economy of emotions, and now obviously the politics of emotions. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about kind of, because this also fits into broader macro picture, because commodification of work and emotions. It is obviously, as you make it very clear, linked to neoliberal shifts in economy and how it shapes everyday life. And a lot of this is really navigating the public and the private. And I think this is very good in your work, very visible. And you have that in Second Shift as well, in the time bind as well. So if you could tell us a little bit more about this kind of macro and micro levels, because they are very much linked in your work, even the focus is on the micro and meso.
Yes, yes. Always, I think what we do in sociology is kind of look behind our shoulder, right? So what's going on in the macro scene that could be accounting for what we're seeing? And the work I'm doing now, of the piece, the macro piece has to do with the decline that people like Raj Chuti, the Harvard economist, described in The American Dream. That is, if you look particularly at the American Dream in the old-fashioned classical sense of comparing a young man's household income when he's 30 with his dad's household income when he was 30, you know, it's going up or down. And the cultural moral frame that Americans are taught to admire, a source of pride, is if you fit that paradigm. And now most people don't. And where I'm studying, they super don't. It's like an exaggeration of the problem of white men in America is where these are the guys I'm hanging out with. And so that's the macro. And so the micro is I'm looking at a pride deficit. You know, this is, they are down on pride that they feel they should feel and don't feel. And I'm looking at how they're responding to a pride crisis in micro ways. So that's
example.
a good example
Yeah,
of how to put them together. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on, there's been significant changes in both sort of academic and sort of in the wider world. One of the changes we've witnessed recently has been the rise of in identity politics. How would you try to explain that through your framework?
Oh my goodness. In a way, every politics is identity politics. And it's pragmatically both a positive thing. It can ignite people's engagement in the public realm, and it can be very divisive. And I'm interested in how to deal with the divisiveness. I'll give you an example from my current field work. Met a guy who said, "I'm a poor hillbilly, and I'm just a poor dumb hillbilly." He said, "I grew up in the holler, and my parents wouldn't let me out of the trailer because my uncle was dealing drugs in the back, and you know, I didn't get to beyond the high school, and that's me," he said almost angrily. And so you know, I'm not ashamed. This is me. And he said, "But I don't see any difference between me and some guy in central Detroit, you know, some black guy, disrupted family, drugs, jail, non-education." And he said, "Only difference is the music." And then I discovered there actually is hillbilly rap. So not even the music is different. So how can how I'm looking for empathy bridges. And if this guy, if he weren't so mad at the left, would be a marvelous example of an empathy bridge. But he also is an example of this empathy envy. You know, you're worried about the blacks, you liberals, but how about us? How do we? So that's my. I'm trying to interview around who's good at this. How can this be done? But identity politics can get in the way of a rainbow coalition. It can say, "Oh, that was an old '60s idea," but now, you know, we're for us. And so you've got a problem on both ends in this country. And anyway, I think if sociology could figure out empathy bridging, you would have to change some of these moral frameworks you're talking about to make room for that. It's a whole area that I think is ripe for, and I invite everybody here to join me in trying to figure this out and see if an emotional perspective doesn't help illuminate it.
Just maybe the last question, and then we can move to the questions and answer session, because we don't really have that much time left. Just a little bit maybe to reflect on what's happening to us now with the COVID-19 crisis. And last time when we had Randy Collins, you know, he's a microsociologist, among other things, focusing on these issues with how do you deal with the interaction ritual change in the context of distance, and there's no physical interaction. I think your approach is also kind of very important in that context when we don't have physical interactions, and even those that we do have are very much constrained with the masks. So I'm thinking, you know, a lot of your work on emotional labor kind of is very applicable in this context in a slightly different way. And I think you mentioned in one of the interviews, you know, how store owners deal with this question of wearing masks, and what do you do? How do you negotiate emotional tensions that emerge in that context when people are hostile to this? And that's very present in some parts of the US. So if you reflect very briefly on
yeah, you know, the COVID has hit red states harder than blue states. It's my impression. If you look at the proportion of the population hit by it, and that it's hit the poorer states harder. And there is a defiance of the government. You know, here are people that feel actually powerless, and so there is the bravado of I'm big. I'm going to. There's a seizing of pride in being the guy who tells the government off. And if these democratic governors are telling us we have to wear masks, we're not going to wear masks. And they are dying. There are 2 people that I wrote about in Strangers in Their Own Land who are now dead of COVID. And I think in one case, it was a bravado case. And another, they so needed their Pentecostal church service that, you know, and God will provide. And in both cases, they were not cautious and self-protective. So there's a curious thing about the cultural frame put on a mask. Is the mask, you can choose to see the mask, as liberals do, as a way of protecting your neighbor. You're not protecting yourself, you're protecting others that you're with. It's a social contribution. And the word protect is important. If it were pitched that way, do you want to protect your family? Do you want to protect your community? Well, you'd have every, you know, large-chested man say, yeah, that's me, and I got my gun too. But it's not put that way. It's not interpreted that way. Oh, you know, the elite scientists and the and the political authorities that are now Democrat are ordering me around and telling me to do this, and then their defiance becomes a seizure of pride. So that's how it's backfired in red states.
Thank you. So we have a bit of time now for a few questions.
Yeah, we already have about 5 questions, I think, and a few more coming. So one question was, would Arlie describe her approach as a synthesis of Marx and Mead? That's
And Freud.
yeah, Freud.
Pieces of Freud and selecting from each, but definitely to look at the emotional unconscious in political life and theorize from there would be Freud.
Okay.
So yes, it would. There's a lot of Mead, a lot of Marx, of looking at alienation. I've been interested in depersonalization. How do people come to feel like nothing, like a commodity, like and with racism too? I mean, to feel like a non-person. That quest I started with Marx, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, interested in alienation and looking at how how capitalism kind of in this race to the bottom creates a race to the bottom human being. And I'm still interested in that, but I think I'm looking at other sources of alienation as well. So Marx definitely, Mead definitely, a lot of me and I, but I would add this interest in the unconscious and feelings from Freud.
Okay, there's another question from John Baker. He says, do you feel any tension between the fact that you are a leftist critic of Trump and your research practice of asking his supporters to open up to you? Do you feel in any way as though you are manipulating them or dissimulating them for the sake of gaining their trust?
Marvelous question. No, not at all. And you know why? It's because I arrived in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and said, hi, I'm a teacher at the University of California, Berkeley, and I don't know anybody from the right. And I think I'm worried about the divide in our country. May I come and learn about you and write about you? And they said back, we know you're a leftist. We know you're against Trump. Yes, but we feel like people like you don't understand us. And so I was completely open. There was no manipulation. They read the book after. I went after the book was out to Lake Charles and Baton Rouge and had dinners for the people that would help me. They are now visiting me. So they're having a look at Berkeley and turning tables. It's quite wonderful. So absolutely not. Of all the books I've written, this has been the most revealing to me and the most life-changing, certainly. Didn't change my politics, but it changed me as a human being, and what I'm aware of has grown larger. I recommend it to all sociologists.
Thanks. Steve, will you take a few more and then I can take...
There's a few questions about your work, the second shift from Eagley. Could you, Arlie, briefly comment on the continuing relevance of the second shift, particularly in light of the pandemic, and why the stalled revolution continues to be stalled?
Yes, it's a wonderful question. It does continue to be stalled. And I think with the pandemic, first of all, we know far more women have withdrawn from the labor force than men and are doing more of the homeschooling when their children can't and are in these a lot of high public contact, low level service jobs. So a lot of them are first responders too, low level kind of caregivers, and working in nursing homes with a shut-in patient. So in a way, they are at an emotional frontier. And all of this added to the usual second shift. I think what's changed from the 1989 when I wrote the second shift is first that first men's jobs have gotten shakier and they're more nervous about their job, and that women are either not getting married, you know, or raising children on their own, which we're not even counting them in the statistic, but they're then doing all of it, or their mothers are helping. It's falling to the female side. Or if they're married, actually men who are married to their wives and have preschool children are doing much more than in the 1980s. So there's been a kind of bifurcation. But I think in a way, COVID has put a whole new burden on, and women are asking their husbands, hey, I really need your help. And a lot of them are not responding.
Okay. Just one more question from Aegon Mulcahy, another colleague. One of the features of your work on emotions is the power of negative emotions, feelings of shame, fear, loss, disrespect. Is that a reflection of the relative power of those emotions and therefore the need to write about these more, or are the fact that they provide a window into important social issues?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Yes, it does in truth take priority, although what I just now said about the beatification of Donald Trump on the part of Christian supporters of his, that's awe and wonder and not negative. But we're in a moment of political tumult, and I think it's what shows in the political discourse, all of these conversational standoffs. And I'm now extremely interested in how people on different sides talk to each other or don't, or yell at each other. How can a micro-sociologist understand those conversations? And there's a lot of, it begins with negativity. I don't think ultimately negative emotions are more important than positive ones, but they come to the fore. At least you have to start with them in emotionally analyzing a political scene today.
Okay, thanks.
There are a few questions on empathy. Suming Kuhl is asking about the rise of empathy surely increases the supply of empathy. It seems odd to me that it is felt to be scarce at the point when the concept has most currency. So she's wondering, you know, are they linked, the empathy envy, with the kind of the explosion of the use of the concept and, you know, the framing of it along the lines of.
Yeah. Well, no, it's I'm going to write a book on empathy. It's so complicated, but it is important. More people are talking about it because its absence is more alarming on the political stage. And there is here in the United States something called the Bridge Alliance, which has some 70 or 80 different organizations. I'm part of one. I'm on the board of high school to high school, kind of trying to get coastal kids inland and southern kids north, northern kids south. So this is going on. It is a movement. And so empathy has some currency in this movement. It's a civic movement. And then there are a number of groups that are trying this. But they are in response to a dug-in quality, a bitterness. If you get into the heartland of the left and the heartland of the right, they don't want to talk to each other. And the left is just as stuck as the right. I'm sorry to say. You know, I've given talks in very liberal places where I thought, oh, I'm just talking to the convinced. Not at all. You want us to talk to those racists? No, no, no. So there's a kind of a protective bubble around each that has protects the feeling rules in each camp and reaffirms identities that are based on those feeling rules, and where very little emotion management is called for. And so to do the empathy bridge, you have to be very mindful of your own feeling rules, your own emotion management, manage your feelings, in fact, to do the kind of field work that a lot of us are doing on the other side. You do have to manage your feelings, let go of yourself, sequester your feelings. I once had a woman who said, I know you don't agree with me. She was a gospel singer in Lake Charles in a Pentecostal megachurch. And she said, I know you don't agree with me. Is it hard for you to listen to me when you don't think that environmental wackos are the Nazis and all these things she was believing? And I said, actually, no, it's not hard at all, because I have my alarm system off. I'm not here to tell you about me. I'm here to learn about you, and I'm grateful for you're helping me. And she said back, oh, I know what you're doing. Yeah, I do that too. I do it with fellow congregants. I do it with my children. And then we had that in common. Empathy bridge that way, underneath the whole structure of the conversation. Mm. And she said, you're my first Democratic friend.
That's a good one. Just a few questions on second shift, maybe, because there are about 3 or 4 questions. Second shift. Somebody is asking, do you still have contact with the interviewed families in the second shift? Has the stalled revolution in the families somehow encouraged them to do their best, considering the second shift of the wives and the child care? And another question on second shift, things have evolved since. Do you feel the second shift is still prevalent in society today?
Yeah. The answer to the first question is, sadly, I think the last contact was about 5 years ago. So those have kind of waned. Do I think the second shift is still relevant? Yes, I do. And we're piling third shifts on with COVID. But the whole sensitizing to the devaluation of the emotional work at home, I think that's ongoing, because there's much of public life and economic life that is inviting us to suppress the importance of that. So it's like an ongoing cultural struggle to defend the very work, invisible work that you're doing to buttress this fragile sphere called the family. So the very invisibility of the struggle, I think, is a problem. And the more we can point to the importance of it, the better.
I think we just have time for one last comment. This is from Kieran. Wondering, given the substantive focus of your work in emotions, if you've been influenced by prose and poetry and the extent to which these have become part of your interpretive lens. Do they give you a language to look at the emotions?
Yes, you know, I do, especially since my quote retirement, I'm reading a lot of fiction, Ishiguro most recently. And as Camus said, fiction is the best way of telling the truth. And yeah, it's I think we should actually add fiction to the syllabus of in sociology courses, you know, on class, on gender, on race. These some of the very best novelists really do excavate and reveal the emotions. And so, yeah, we need to take that seriously. It's a wonderful comment.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Arlie. Again, we'll finish now because it's been an hour and it was a really enjoyable discussion. We'll have a recording of this in a few weeks' time, hopefully, so people who were not able to make it and people who weren't able to ask questions, because so many questions, there was another 10 questions which we couldn't answer. They could at least reflect on this. Just to say that we'll continue with the series. The next one will be Michael Mann in I forgot the date, Steve. What date is it?
I think it's May the 12th.
May the 12th. Okay, so that's next in line. And thanks again, Arlie. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Very enjoyable. Bye-bye.
Bye.